Okay, I'm Alice Sullivan. I'm a sociologist at UCL. And I just want to say it's such a huge privilege to be on this amazing panel, and thank you to the Cambridge Red Fems for organising it. I'm going to talk about academic freedom, anti-intellectualism and misogyny. So the genderist ideology is centred on a mantra: trans women are women. But since the statement that trans women are women is patently false, we obviously can't treat it as an empirical proposition. It's not intended as a testable empirical statement. We could treat it as a tenet of faith, like this wine is the blood of Christ. But in fact, primarily it's a demand. You will treat all men who say they identify as women as though they were women, and will profess to believe that they are women regardless of their appearance or their behaviour in all contexts and under all circumstances, from a rape crisis centre to a rugby match, with no compromise and no discussion. So it's an absolutist ideology. So why is the reaction why is the reaction to women who challenge this ideology so vicious and so extreme? Well, I think the answer lies in the anti-intellectual postmodernist foundations of this ideology. So the genderist doctrine is uniquely reliant on fake statistics, poor analogies, and emotional blackmail. This is the ideology that brought us the arguments: clownfish can change sex, therefore it follows that humans must be able to change sex too. Men could run as fast as women if they only tried harder. And my personal favourite from the defence barrister in the Maya Forstater trial: belief in sexual dimorphism in humans is less than 30 years old. Of course, they don't want people to hear these arguments. Of course, they prefer no debate because it's crazy. And if people knew about it, they would laugh. The move towards post-truth, anti-scientific discourse undermines democracy. And we see this on the right in politics, in climate change denial, in anti-vax scares, in politicians lying with impunity. But postmodernism is the post-truth of the left. It is the anti-intellectualism of people who self-identify as intellectuals. And we see it manifested most clearly in the denial of the existence and social salience of biological sex. Oh, I went on too fast for that. But I was going to say, so why academic freedom? Why is it so important? It's a value that separates democracies from totalitarian regimes. So it's not just about protecting academics. Obviously, no worker should be sacked for participating in the democratic process. So what's special about academic freedom? It gives special protection to scholars because they don't just have a right to take part in democracy, they have a duty to use their expertise to inform public debate on matters of public importance. And that matters even more now in the current post-truth climate. But the academic freedom we once took for granted is under attack. It isn't limited to this issue of sex and gender, but this is its most extreme manifestation. And if we can't protect academic freedom on this front, then we have lost it. And the context of this is that trans activists aim to abolish the status of biological sex in law, in data, and in language, and replace it with gender identity. And they command that there shall be no debate on this. They claim that debate constitutes literal violence and thereby justify using actual violence and intimidation to shut women up. So transactivism has given misogynists a free pass to bully women while claiming to be progressive. And this is some of the violent imagery that has become so familiar in recent years against women. And it's extraordinary, I think, to women of my generation who thought that we'd made progress as women to see this kind of, not just to see this violent imagery, but that people don't realise that a movement that's using this violent imagery against women cannot be progressive. This image is Maria McLaughlin, a 60-year-old feminist who was beaten up by a young man, trans-identified, for having the temerity to organise a feminist meeting. That is literal violence for those of us who understand what the word literal means. And this is some more misogynist imagery that we're all very familiar with. Shut the fuck up, TERF. No TERFs on our turf. This kind of stuff is in our universities and sometimes even being circulated by staff groups. It's absolutely horrifying. Can you imagine any other oppressed group, because women are an oppressed group, being bullied and insulted in this way by academic staff and peers or students? So academics who don't adhere to this strict line on sex and gender have faced campaigns of blacklisting, smears, no platforming, organised efforts to get them fired, rape threats, death threats. The level of hatred and overtly misogynistic bullying is just extraordinary. It doesn't compare to anything I've seen in any other debate within academia or outside academia. And the people under attack aren't mavericks or extremists. They're people who believe things like there are two sexes. They're people who believe what everyone believes, but are just brave enough to say it and are being punished for that. If everyone who believed these things said so, this would all end very quickly. And all of these women who are being attacked and bullied uphold trans people's human rights. I haven't come across a single example of an academic who doesn't uphold trans people's human rights. And yet every week there are new examples of events shut down with threats of violence, women being bullied and smeared. So this week, a planned event at Edinburgh University discussing how gender issues are taught in Scotland's schools was shut down because the university could not guarantee the safety of the speakers or the participants. And who are most of those speakers and participants? Obviously, they are women. Sometimes we hear, oh, both sides are, a bit aggressive in this debate. Well, it's nonsense. One side is using these tactics. Universities regularly hold events organised by trans activists. They have never been shut down or threatened. So, postmodernists believe that by changing language, they can change reality. And in a sense, they're right, because by removing our ability to describe ourselves as women, they remove our ability to talk about our shared material reality. And by removing the category of sex from data, they remove the ability to collect accurate data that describes our position. So this is some data on the gender pay gap, for example, or the sex pay gap, as we should really call it. It's quite big. But this matters obviously not just in pay. Everything, I'm a sociologist, everything that you look at, from pay to crime to sports participation to voting behaviour to health, sex is a huge predictor of all of these things. Failing to document those differences doesn't make them magically go away. It damages our ability to monitor inequalities and therefore to tackle them. So the primary victims of the suppression of academic freedom are not academics. It's the wider society, and often it's some of the most vulnerable in our society. Take, for example, the attempts to shut down research on trends in young people, and girls in particular, and gender identity. So we've seen a massive increase in the numbers of young people, and especially girls, presenting at gender identity clinics with gender dysphoria. So you would think encouraging research in this area would be really, really important. The Tavistock Clinic in London reports that referrals to its gender identity service have more than doubled in recent years, but referrals for girls have multiplied by a factor of 44. And teenage girls are now 70% of those referred, and we know that's really completely different from the older generation of transgender people, where it was very much predominantly male to female. So something interesting's happened, and surely we should want to research that. Yet a research paper by Lisa Lippman looking into the reasons for that surge in gender dysphoria among teenage girls led to protests from trans activists who tried to have the paper suppressed. And similarly, research on detransitioning has been blocked by Bar Spa University. And there's obviously a wider chilling effect. For every case like that we hear about, you've got to think, why would a researcher go into this area or even attempt this research, knowing that they'd be bullied and even potentially have their families targeted, as in the Michael Bailey case that was documented by Alice Drager. The wider context here is one of a crisis in adolescent girls' mental health. So 24% of 14-year-old girls in the UK are classified as depressed, according to the Millennium Cohort study, compared to 9% of boys in the same age group. And we know also that there's overlap between gender dysphoria and conditions like autism and other mental health conditions. So suppressing research in this area clearly is not benefiting or serving the interests of adolescent girls, vulnerable girls. So whose interest is it serving? So what can we do? Well, universities, I think, are really struggling with this. They do have new challenges in an era of political polarization combined with social media activism. There are other factors that feed into making this problematic: managerialism, the treatment of students as customers, precarity in the academic workforce. All of these things contribute to the problems of bullying and silencing. But universities really need to buck up and get to grips with this, because there is no excuse for failing to take action against staff and students who engage in campaigns of harassment. And institutions also need to pay attention to the organisations that they work with and allow into their institutions. Organisations that promote no debate are complicit in the bullying of feminists, and they have no proper place in any educational organisation, regardless of their past good works or how long-standing these organisations are. If they promote no debate, they shouldn't be in an educational organisation. Universities have to stand up for educational and scientific prerogatives, and they need to understand that all of their staff and students need to understand those. Finally, I want to say something about education. So everyone who works in education should understand the need for reasoned and evidence-based discussion. Learning is not possible without the inclination to listen and engage. And when universities give in to a vocal minority who want to silence others, that leads to an impoverished intellectual environment for everybody. It is profoundly unfair on the vast majority of our students, dangerous for intellectual life, and ultimately for our democracy. So I'm going to leave the last word to Hannah Arendt. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the dedicated communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, true and false, no longer exists.